Hello, gang. Tattooed Biker here with you, and tonight I have 5 true story and encounter reports of unidentified cryptids and creatures submitted by viewers just like you. Now, I don't know what these things are. One witness ventures a guess that one was a skinwalker, but to me, that seems to be a catch-all term for unexplained creatures in the Southwest. You'll need to be the judge of that one. As for the rest, well, I just don't know. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on these, but to get there, you better grab your boots and let's ride.
Number 1. Hey TB, one night we were driving home from a campground in North Alabama where we had been visiting family. The roads were dark and twisty, and as I turned a corner, I saw a creature in the ditch in the flash of my headlights. It looked exactly like an albino Bengal tiger eating a deer carcass. I was so shocked that I didn't say anything, just clenched up my fist and my heart was racing. I glanced over at my wife, and she was gripping the armrest with white knuckles. Without prompting her with what I saw, I said, "Did you see that?" She nodded and said, "Was that a white tiger eating a deer?" Strangely, or because I was so freaked out, we didn't turn around. I told myself it was some garbage bags or something, but the fact that my wife and I saw exactly the same thing, and that I saw it raise its head with bloody jaws, still bothers me to this day. For the record, North Alabama has a regional cryptid called the Alabama white thing, sometimes just white thing, which appears as a large white cat, a wolf the size of a horse, or just a shapeless white form, or a large white humanoid. So I guess we saw the Alabama white thing. By the way, we were near Lake Gunnersville State Park. Thanks for reading. Signed, Carter. Number 2. Hey Biker, I thought that you might find this interesting. My grandfather told me this story when I was staying at his place a couple of years ago. I don't remember how it came up exactly. It was so odd and out of the blue, and I was so taken aback that I wrote down all the details that I could remember after the fact, so this isn't a word-for-word transcription, but it's pretty close. Anyways, back in the 1960s, my grandfather on my dad's side was drafted into the Army for the Vietnam War. He got discharged in late 1972 and drifted apart from all of his war buddies, except for one. They lived remarkably close to one another in Washington State and both exhibit some serious post-war PTSD issues. Therefore, they both decide to go on a hunting trip together around the autumn time of 1973 to try and find healing or some closure post-war. As he tells it, he would always hunt deer in the woods behind his house. Back in those days, his home was more of a cabin with just basic necessities. It's probably late afternoon in rural Washington, and anyone who's been in the Pacific Northwest knows just how thick and dense the forest can be, not to mention the fog. When it's bad, you really can't see that far ahead of you. Sight lines become blurred, sounds around you get amplified, and the sense of isolation can cause your blood pressure to rise. So my grandfather and his friend from Nam are both hunting off trail, tying bright markers to tree branches as they move through the underbrush, just so they don't get lost, when suddenly they hear a sound. It's the blaring sound, like a train horn. It's so loud that it causes the two men to get disoriented. My grandfather recalls that he fell to his knees, hands over his ears screaming, feeling his throat moving air but not hearing it. The sound doesn't seem to have a direction. It seems to be all-encompassing, just everywhere. It's so loud that even the ground is shaking, and like a bad cliche, as soon as it began, it stopped, dissipating in an instant. They're both left kneeling there, stunned, Their ears are ringing so badly that they can't hear their own voices. They can feel their mouths moving, but nothing happens. As the sun sets, they begin to head back, obviously spooked beyond belief. As their eardrums are shot, they have to scribble notes to each other, just to communicate as they hike back to my grandfather's cabin. As they are heading back, they see something hanging behind a tree up ahead on the trail. The outlines seem blurred, but as it floats, the best way that my grandpa described it, towards them it's revealed. It wasn't like looking in a mirror per se, because it was a real creature. My grandfather felt it. The thing was itself blurry and fuzzy, but my grandfather said, he was in his early 30s at the time, that he could see himself in it as an old man, very frail and with sunken eyes. He had to squint, but his facial features were the same. His war friend, however, saw his reflection as having a bullet hole in its head. The figure then morphed into something solid black, like an eternal void, like death itself. The early evening pinkish sun rays had just ended when they reached this blackness. They panicked at this point, running backwards into the woods, screaming like madmen. As darkness fell, they decided to keep on going, refusing to camp out in those woods. When recounting this story for me, my grandfather, never very religious, said, "I don't know what in the hell that thing we saw was, but I know for sure that it didn't belong on this earth. What still bothers me is that I never saw what it actually looked like. It could have been Satan itself, because it seemed to be pure evil. And I'll tell you, I saw true evil in people during the war, but that thing, I don't know. It was just something else. It was an evil being, and if I would have gotten closer, well, he just trailed off there, but his uncomfortable, haunted glance practically finished the rest." After sprinting for a few miles, their flashlights luckily illuminated their trail markers, and they eventually reached the cabin. The night sky that night was completely moonless, and they anxiously stayed in the cabin until sunrise, their loaded hunting rifles next to them at all times. The windows and doors were all locked, blinds all shut, and no lights on. If that thing, whatever it was still out there, their wooden door would have been a relatively fragile barrier. Their anxiety-filled pacing must have made time slow to a crawl. At one point they broke down and began praying, neither man ever being religious. Remind you, these are two battle-hardened Vietnam veterans that both saw combat. They may have had PTSD, but for something to scare both of them to this degree, yeah, it bothers you, doesn't it? Personally, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. Yet, with this said, no other strange encounters or experiences happened that night, or ever again for my grandfather. He actually moved shortly thereafter to a different town in Washington, and promptly met my grandmother. He refuses, to this day, to step foot back into any forest. Sadly, my grandfather said that the thing that he and his friend saw in the woods that night was a bad and accurate omen for the rest of their lives. My grandfather had struggled with alcoholism his entire life, and even today, he's had a liver transplant and still drinks daily. His friend, however, took his own life in 1975. He just couldn't handle his own personal demons. Perhaps if there had been proper mental health services back then, things might have turned out different. Thanks for reading. Signed, Samuel. Number 3. Hi, TB. I just watched your Cocoa Beach, Florida Sea Creature story, and I wanted to tell you my story from the same area. It was back in 2012 when my boyfriend and I started hanging out. It was late at night, and we'd gone to a park just to chill. I live in Gulfstream, the Florida Panhandle to be exact, and our town has a bay, so the park had docks for people to string up their boats. We were just sitting on one of the floating docks chatting when I happened to look across the water at the shore. Something was floating on top of the water. It looked like a styrofoam fishing buoy. I'm not sure what it was, but it was enough to grab my attention. Our conversation lulled, and I didn't know at the moment that my boyfriend was also watching it. And I watched this thing pull itself up onto the sand in the light of a street lamp. The closest thing that I can say to describe it as is a person wearing a black morph suit, crawling low to the ground on all fours like in a horror movie. Its elbows were out and its legs were at odd angles. Anyway, it slithered off into the sawgrass, and my boyfriend and we confirmed that we both saw the same thing. Him, skeptic that he is, dragged me over to check for tracks in the sand. And there they were, handprints with fresh splash marks. I'm not kidding. Actual 5-fingered handprints. We jumped into the car pretty fast and sped out of there. We both knew a whole lot about the wildlife in our area, and we still couldn't come up with an answer as to what this was. I'd love to hear any of your theories. Thanks. Signed, Tamra. Number 4. Hello, Biker. This happened on the 12th of August, 2020. And I scribbled down as many details as I could on a scrap of paper while in my car at the time. I took a drive through Wyoming and then back to Mirror Lake Scenic Byway, back down into Utah. Mirror Lake Highway is beautiful, and being a weekday, it wasn't crowded at all, so I could take my time and really enjoy it. One of the pull-offs on the road is the Slate Gorge Overlook. There's a short trail there that leads to the overlook, and you can look down into the gorge and see the Provo River. No one was there, so I took a seat and just let my mind wander a bit. I'd been there probably 20 minutes or so when I saw something come out from behind the trees. I was excited, thinking maybe it was a moose or elk, and I always did like seeing those, but what appeared was what looked like a hunched-over person that was sort of half walking, half crawling rather slowly. While that in itself was really weird, it was even stranger that it looked like a person wearing a really heavy, crudely fashioned and gray fur coat with a hood, but one that was several sizes too small for them. It didn't really make sense at all looking at it. It was probably 7 to 8 feet high, but really thin. I'd say less than 200 pounds or so. Also, it was around 80 degrees out, with temperatures near 90 down in the valley, so it wasn't cold by any means. While the sides are kind of steep, you can get down into the gorge without too much of an issue. I kind of thought that maybe it was someone doing a TikTok video or something like that, but I didn't see anyone else around that would be filming. Eventually, whatever it was, made it to the water and stuck its head down for a drink. As it looked like it was finished, a group of people was coming up on the overlook, and they had kids with them who were making a lot of noise. That can echo through the gorge a bit, and this creature or person heard it and then took off incredibly fast, down on all fours, over pretty uneven ground. Now, I'm not sure what I saw. In all likelihood, it could have been a person just getting in touch with nature and wearing some kind of weird homemade costume, but the way they moved was just unnatural for a human, especially when the noise spooked it and it took off. It kind of scurried. I'm sort of conflicted between a person in some kind of weird fursuit and an actual cryptid. Both seem plausible, and I don't really want to jump to conclusions on what it might be. Now, I've always been into Bigfoot, and it just didn't remind me of anything that I've ever read about Bigfoot. So I've pretty much ruled that out, but otherwise I just really don't know. I wish I'd thought to bring my phone with me, so I could have snapped a photo, but I had left it in my center console since I didn't want it going off and spoiling my quiet time. Any thoughts on this? I really don't know much about Utah cryptids other than the Bigfoot sightings. But thanks for letting me share. Signed, Teddy. Number 5. Dear Biker, this happened to my son when he was 17 years old. We lived in northern New Mexico at the time. My son, let's call him Cade here, was riding along with his friends, Dave and Drew. They were in Dave's truck and Drew was driving. It was night and they were heading to Dave's house. Drew lived out in the country, so the road they were on was isolated and surrounded by desert. In fact, that whole area is flat and mostly dirt. As they're driving along, they see a man standing in the middle of the road. Dave slows down and they all just expect the guy to move off to the side. But the guy doesn't move. He just stands there. Dave slows to a stop and the guy is just standing outside the light from the headlights. He's wearing jeans and some sort of long-sleeve shirt. They couldn't make out the features of the guy's face, but they could tell that he was facing them. Nobody moves for a few seconds, and the kids start to talk about going around him, but they're not sure if they should pass by this guy or just turn around and go back the other way. When suddenly, the guy drops down to all fours and starts running towards the truck. All the kids start screaming. Dave slams the truck into reverse and floors it. Now they're going backwards on this dark country road, and this guy is down and chasing them on all fours, and he's keeping up with the truck. Dave goes faster, and finally, the guy drops out of sight. Dave turned the truck around, and they all came back to our house. I was actually in the living room when they came running in, slammed and locked the door, and went tearing up the stairs to Cade's room. I went up to see what was going on, and that is when they told me the story. I've actually never seen them so pale and frightened. They were all completely freaked out. This happened on a Friday night around 8 p.m. These are kids who would normally rather be anywhere except home on a weekend, but that weekend they stayed at our place the whole time. They didn't go out at all and then only left because they had school on Monday. It took a month before they wanted to go out again at night. They would usually go anywhere during the day, but at night they would all just gather at our house. After a little research, they had all agreed that it was a skinwalker. Even to this day, if I bring up that night, Cade and his friends will get really quiet and have a scared look on their faces. It took a very long time for them to get past it, and they still think that talking about it might make it come back somehow. I just wanted to tell you about this. I thought you would find it interesting. Thanks for reading. Signed, Kyle. And there it is. All the unidentified cryptid reports that I have for you tonight. So I'm anxious to hear your theories about these down in the comment section, but just please, keep it respectful. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. And as always, until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe. I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker, out.